immigration law and what the Trump administration does in the next 4 years is going to be defining for his presidency. I think that it is not just about illegal immigration, deportation, repatriation, what have you, but it is really about immigration, the umbrella of all areas of immigration, not the least of which is, of course, all the visa issues, but birthright citizenship. And you have been writing and arguing with your colleagues for decades on this issue. And I want you to just start off giving us a kind of a specific, usually people will say, just give me a brief overview. I'm actually interested in the evolution from our founding to when we begin to have the cases that sort of turn the tide and what you're trying to restore us to, the precedents.
So on birthright citizenship, look, the common misconception is that we inherited the English common law of the soil. Jus soli is the Latin phrase. And it's an old feudal idea that everybody that is born in the king's realm owes a perpetual allegiance to the king because he's their lord liege. That's very feudal. And you could never renounce that allegiance to the king. There was no right of expatriation, no human right to disavow your existing allegiance and take up another. No ability to have consent to the kind of government you're going to have. Well, we rejected all of that with the Declaration of Independence. The very last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and we hereby absolve all allegiance to the king or to the crown. I mean, it was the most eloquent repudiation of that old feudal doctrine ever written. And yet some courts, in the first 50 years of our nation's history, continue to apply the old English common law. The most significant of them was a New York court, but the New York State Constitution very specifically said the courts are to apply the common law unless and until changed by the legislature. So he really didn't have any option. Now fast forward to the Civil War era, Supreme Court issues one of its most egregiously wrong decisions in history, the Dred Scott case, and said African Americans are not citizens and can never be citizens, whether they're free or slaves, which was preposterous. And so after the Civil War, the Congress took up a statute to defining citizenship that said all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, that's the key phrase, are citizens. And then when later that year, when they said, all right, well, this may not be within our constitutional authority to do that, and even if it is, a future Congress could repudiate it. So we're going to make a constitutional amendment to lock that into place. And they changed the language in the constitutional amendment a little bit. It says all persons born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction are citizens. Now, some people have said that just means subject to our laws. And if you're born here within our borders, you're subject to our laws. And so everybody born here except diplomat children are citizens. But that's not what they meant by that subject to the jurisdiction. They would call that territorial or partial jurisdiction, subject to the laws. But when they were asked point blank, did that's what they meant? They said, no, we mean complete jurisdiction, owing allegiance, such as exists right now, which is under the 66 Civil Rights Act. It said not born to any foreign power. Now, that excluded in the debate a very important category that's contained in President Trump's recent executive order. It excluded temporary visitors who were here lawfully, but they were here. We didn't have tourist visas or whatever, but they were here temporarily for business reasons or tourist reasons or what have you. But they were here temporarily. They still owed allegiance to their home country. And if children were born to them while they were here visiting, those children owed through their parents allegiance to that home country. They were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in that way. They were called temporary sojourners. Was the phrase, the clever creative phrase they used at the time. And so that's what they meant. And now we didn't have illegal immigration. We didn't have restrictions on immigration at the time. So there's really no debate about illegal immigrants. But if temporary visitors who are here lawfully aren't entitled to the citizenship, then certainly those who are never here present lawfully at all are not entitled to citizenship. And what the founders are doing, or framers of the 14th Amendment are doing, is really connecting back into the Declaration of Independence, the notion that governments are based on consent of the governed. And people come together and create governments that they think are best conducive to protect their inalienable rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And you know, you got to have mutual consent to create that political community. And without that consent, you don't have citizenship. And it works both ways. Our Congress has the power to decide how much legal immigration we think we can absorb into this country without altering the fundamental nature of our country. That's why Congress has the power over naturalization. And the Constitution's amendment, the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause, sets a floor, but how far above that floor we go is entirely up to Congress, a political question, a political judgment. But Congress can no more make citizens of, say, people in Mexico City, or more recently, I suppose I should say, in Canada, than people who are not here lawfully can lay claim to citizenship without our consent. They could offer citizenship to people in Canada, and then it's up to the people in Canada whether they want to accept it and join our political community or not. But without that mutual consent, you don't have citizenship. And that's what the founders very explicitly describe in the debate over the drafting of the 14th Amendment, and in the ratification debate, too, where they all understood they were codifying the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which quite explicitly said, born here on U.S. soil and not subject to any foreign power. And they all thought that the 14th Amendment's language was accomplishing exactly the same thing.
Well, you mention, you bring up the Civil Rights Act of 1866, is that it? And then we have the 14th Amendment, and I can't remember the year that was ratified.
It was 2 years later, 1868. But the debates in the Congress are going on simultaneously. Immediately after the 66 Civil Rights Act, they start debating the 14th Amendment.
It always bothers me when I look at these things and I say, why is it so difficult to just look at what the men who submitted the bills, who wrote the bills, they used the language, and then they got up and spoke about it. And they defined it. They said, no, we don't mean this. We mean this. And it's all there. I've got it on my computer. It's all there. The language is what it means is there's a different kind of jurisdiction. If I went on a worldwide tour and I stopped in France, I don't suddenly become an allegiant to the French government. They can't draft me into their military. They can't require certain things that only a citizen of a nation that owes their allegiance to that country. And then I go to Spain, and now I'm now what could Spain draft me if I went and took a trip in that direction? Then I go to Russia. Whatever. The point is that it doesn't make any sense. If I go to France, I have to obey their speeding laws. I mean, their traffic laws. But I don't become a patriot and a citizen and have an allegiance to their government. Isn't that the difference between the two?
It's very straightforward. And, there are scholars that are just taking an idiotic position, saying things like, if they're not subject to our jurisdiction, then we can't arrest them for violating our immigration laws. I mean, it's just laughably absurd. And yet there are people out there taking that position. The distinction between what the drafters of the language call partial or territorial jurisdiction and complete or allegiance-owing jurisdiction, it is a pretty simple concept. I don't use France as an example. I use British. If a British citizen subject is over here visiting, he has to follow our traffic laws, like you say. He's got to drive on the right side of the road rather than the left side of the road. But we don't draft him into our military. We don't prosecute him for treason if he takes up arms against us. We treat him as an enemy combatant. He has no allegiance that he's breached by taking up arms against us. So there's no treasonous conduct, even if there's military conduct. It seems like a fairly simple concept, but I don't understand why they want this rule that just makes no sense, and it was never codified as part of our Constitution. We, the sovereign people, never agreed to such a rule because that's not what the language of the 14th Amendment meant when it was ratified, and it's kind of crept in now just by fiat.
It's sort of like, well, let's look at consent to the governed, because I think that there is that is a foundational issue here. Not only should we have, they should have to consent to becoming a naturalized citizen in whatever form it is, but we should consent to their becoming a citizen of our nation, of our body politic. But I think that sometimes it becomes very mechanical. This one debate you had, I'm trying to remember the name of the gentleman, and it was so funny because it was as if he was treating us, the people, as if we were just economic units. Well, we'll have so much more money. The economy will be so terrific if we don't have any laws in the world restricting immigration. Of course, he was libertarian. And I thought, the bounds or bonds that bind us together, and it's more like an extension of what a family is. You don't look at your children. My 90-year-old mother lives with me. I don't look at her as an economic entity. I think of her as family, and I don't just invite anybody into my family and into my household, and I would also get the consent of the governed, if you will, the population. But I want to take it out of the legal realm to a certain extent and ask your opinion about, do you believe that the American people in practice are really being heard, that our will, our opinions, our needs, our desires, our wants, our demands are really being heard over the past 20, 40 years in this country with regard to immigration?
Well, I don't think so. Until January 20th of this year, the American people are demanding that this problem be fixed for a very long time, and the politicians are just ignoring it. I think the business class wing of the Republican Party likes the potential for cheap labor, and we got to hold on to power, even though we can't convince our fellow citizens. We got to hold on to power wing of the Democrat Party. So let's bring all these future Democrat voters in and give them lots of benefits so that they'll stay voting for Democrats and we can hold on to power. Those two wings formed a very powerful combination and have for half a century. But look, there's something even deeper going on, and it goes back a full century. The advent of the progressive movement, that the Constitution was an impediment to good government because it had to rely on the authority of the people. And we all know they're a bunch of flyover, deplorable hicks. And would we be better off if we could be ruled by experts that didn't have to be accountable to the people? And you see that play out in a whole number of arenas. You see it play out with our representatives in Congress no longer really pass laws. They pass that off to agencies that they've created independent of any political accountability. Yeah, the deep state, the entrenched bureaucracy. But that's all arises out of the same repudiation of the notion that it's we, the people, that are the sovereign authority in this country. We have to listen to Fauci tell us, whether we take a jab or not, whether to wear a mask or not, because, he's an expert. And how dare you even challenge him or raise questions about it? And now more recently, they've taken that idea and put it on steroids and said, if you dare challenge the government when they've got expertise, so-called expertise, then we're going to destroy you because we can't have that misinformation out there. But that's, and the same thing's been going on with the immigration front. They come up with these well, there's not that many people that are here, so you don't need to worry about it. Or when it may be 34 billion people, having a profound impact on our culture, on our institutions. Look, the founders understood if you take a bunch of people who have been habituated to living under a despotism, and they all come here all at once with those habits, it will have a fundamental change in the character of our governing institution. And that's why Congress has the power of naturalization to control that. And the word has taken on a negative connotation now, but it's a very positive word, and that is assimilation, where we welcome people from all the world as long as you become American. We don't want you here if you're gonna act like you're still a member of a different political community within our borders, an island within an island or what have you, causing trouble and wreaking havoc on our. That's not tied to race or ethnic background or religion or anything else. It is tied to the habits and customs that you come here with. And they've got to be able to assimilate into American habits and customs and the notion of consent of the governed and the authority of the sovereign people and the notion of individual rights, even against wills of the majority. All of that is part of our constitutional system. And this question of how much immigration, lawful immigration, we can tolerate without altering the fundamental nature of our political community is a political judgment that we assign to Congress, not to people who unilaterally break our laws to alter that fundamental nature of our political community.
This last election was a repudiation of open borders and all that. But I feel as if Congress still does not really hear us. And I believe that there are going to be, maybe adjustments in immigration, whether it be in the visa systems that I am very much believing. I believe very much that we must alter this. We really have an open door immigration system of legal immigration. It's flooding in the masses of numbers. There's no control. Our middle class is shrinking. They're struggling. They are unable to compete with low wage immigrants that are taking the same jobs. They're being laid off. And then immigrants are being hired who are here on temporary visas who go on to permanently replace them. All of these things are happening. And I think that the time right now for us to be vocal and to be involved is, it's now. However, what I'm worried about is as a representative constitutional republic, I guess, our representatives are supposed to be hearing our voice and voting, and that's how our voice is heard. But I don't think that that's necessarily where we are in Congress. And I'm wondering, do we have any other remedy to prevent this open door legal immigration?
Well, I think this is the significance of the boldness of President Trump's executive orders, not just the birthright citizenship orders, but the DOGE orders and the immigration orders more broadly. What he has done is challenge the Congress in a very significant way with these executive orders and forcing Congress either to get on board or not. And if they don't get on board, because President Trump has got the pulse of the American people better than most presidents in my lifetime. And he's getting issues that are 80-20%, to use kind of the polling analogy. And if the Republicans in Congress don't go along with him, it's very likely that they'll lose their next elections in the primary. And the Democrats, are just so hostile to anything that comes from Trump's pen or mouth that they support the opposite of whatever he does, no matter how many years they've been supporting his position or how low it finds support in the polls among the American people. And, President Trump is just playing them like a fiddle. You look at, they wouldn't even stand up to congratulate a kid with brain cancer when President Trump gives him, an honorary Secret Service membership. It's bizarre. And yet what Trump has done here, so you're looking at illegal immigration undercutting American wages. Whose wages are they undercutting? They're not undercutting the elite classes, the college professors and the government bureaucrats. They're undercutting the middle and lower middle income class. You look at his steel tariff to try and rebuild our manufacturing plants. Who's that benefiting? Rank and file union members who've lost their jobs and now live in cities that have boarded up factories, and he's trying to bring them back. This is a fundamental realigning of our political arena that he has accomplished here. And there are still a bunch of Republicans that kind of like the old country club atmosphere that they'd grown accustomed to. And they don't understand that what happened here is a tectonic. And if they don't get on board with it, then they ought to do what Liz Cheney's done and just go to the other party or with them. Because
that's a good idea.
A fundamental change. Yeah.
Back to birthright, the transition from what, say, a Thomas Jefferson and the other founders wanted or expressed regarding immigration. And then we had a bunch of years until we got to Wong. And what I don't understand is this, Wong, what's his
Wong Kim Ark.
Kim Ark.
Wong Kim Ark.
Kim, I should be able to remember. Wong Kim Ark. So Wong Kim Ark comes along in, what year was that?
1898.
Yeah, 1898. Up until 1898, wasn't subject to the jurisdiction thereof, which is really just I don't know, do you call it a corollary? Just the flip side of what the 1866 civil rights law said. Can you repeat those two phrases, the 66 civil rights?
So 66 says all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed. And then you had this issue arising because the Indian tribes were not foreign powers, they were dependent domestic powers. And that was creating some ambiguities or loopholes. And so they changed the language with just that in mind, nothing else. Said, okay, we won't do not subject to a foreign power. We'll say, are you subject to our jurisdiction? Complete jurisdiction. That excludes the Indians, even though they're not a foreign power. And it excludes temporary visitors. And then modernly, it excludes people who aren't even here with legal permission at all. So that was all covered by that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
Okay,
if you
I get this now. Let me
Yeah.
just stop for a second there, because you just clarified something with the Indian point that now I understand why they flipped it. You're saying that the Indian clause was there because the Indians, American Indians, had allegiance to their tribes in their tribal lands. And so therefore they were not similarly or exactly subject to the jurisdiction of the United States of America. I'm sure you could say that much better than I just did. But because it created confusion in the 66 Civil Rights Act that they said, and not subject to any foreign power. And then they do this, parenthetic about the Indians. And they said, let's clean this up because that's causing problems within 2 years. And they're debating this whole time. It seems to me that when you're looking at original intent, when the 66 law is very, very clear that they can't be subject to a foreign power, as being debated, and they flip the language within 2 years of constant debate, that would be the controlling legal doctrine or language or maybe the interpretation, it would seem, from 66 to 68. And so they just flipped it and said that you are subject to the jurisdiction here in our jurisdiction in America and in the state in which you reside or they reside.
Right.
Now, isn't that big? The residing.
Subject to the, you got to be residing. That was the key, not just temporarily passing through and not here illegally, because residing conveys a legal domicile. And when you fast forward to the Wong Kim Ark case in 1898, the Chinese parents were here legally domiciled. The court refers to that 28 times in the opinion. It's part of the question presented. Is a child born to Chinese immigrants who are lawfully domiciled and permanently domiciled in this country, is he a citizen? Now, there's language in the case that, kind of goes back to the old English feudal common law. But that's all dicta. The actual holding in the case of the children of lawfully domiciled parents are going to be citizens. And there's another aspect of this, because what had happened is we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we'd entered into a treaty with the Emperor of China that did not allow Chinese immigrants in the United States to ever leave their subjectship of the emperor. We didn't let them become citizens. In other words, we did not let them exercise their human right to leave their prior allegiance that we asserted as a human right, a natural right, a fundamental right in our own Declaration of Independence.
So did the Chinese emperor say, I don't want my citizens that owe me subjects? So wrong.
Yeah.
My subjects, when they can come work for you, they can send Western Union back. No, just kidding about that. I don't think they have that technology, but they remain my subjects for their entire life. That's what he's saying.
Yeah. The very thing we repudiated in the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, it wasn't just the Declaration. We fought a second war over this issue. Because in the early 1800s, the British Navy was impressing American sailors and forcing them to go to work on British ships. That was the cause of the War of 1812.
Right.
You said you don't get to do that, and the British said, "Well, we don't recognize their right to renounce their allegiance to the king." Said, "Well, sorry, we fought a war against you over that, and we won. So you better recognize them." All right, but they continued to say, we're not accepting this notion that you can renounce your allegiance to the king, and that led to the War of 1812. So this is not something that they made up in 1868. Because it's part and parcel of our founding and the principles underlying our founding.
So what you're saying then, when it comes to use, I know use is spelled J-U-S.
Yep.
But is it solely S-O-L-I?
Yeah. Use the J would get a Y pronunciation in the Latin. So use solely.
Right.
The law of the soil. The law of the soil.
Right.
And the English said, if you're born on our soil, it doesn't matter whether you're here visiting or whatever. You're born on our soil, then you're the king. You're the king's subject. You owe him perpetual allegiance and can never renounce. In other words, there's no right of expatriation under that old feudal system.
And how does that, explain to me again, how that use solely and our repudiation of that in our Declaration and all the writings of the founders, how birthright citizenship hinges on these legal doctrines or standards?
You have to understand the repudiation of use solely to give voice to the critical phrase in the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction. It can't mean subject to perpetual allegiance without undercutting one of the core principles of our founding, which is another reason why the people that drafted that said it means complete jurisdiction. Do you owe allegiance to this country through your parents when you're born? Then we're going to recognize you as part of our political community as well. But we never impose on you a command of perpetual allegiance. If when you come of age you decide I'd rather be in Canada or France or Mexico than a U.S. citizen, you're free to do that, because you are now by your action withdrawing your consent to be part of that political community, and we're not going to force you to stay. But we're not going to make you citizens, allow you to lay claim to citizenship without that allegiance. If you owe allegiance to another country through your parents, then you're not automatically a citizen.
I like the way you just said that, because it's just a little bit different turn of phrase or looking at it from a different angle. I don't want somebody here. And most Americans would agree with me. I know this. I don't want somebody here who has an allegiance to another government. I'm Irish by ancestry. And I'll bring this up and say I was born on St. Patrick's Day. I felt so Irish. My grandma and aunts had red hair, and I loved being Irish. So I have an affection toward Ireland, no matter how much they get me mad sometimes. But I have an affection there. but I do not have an allegiance to the Irish Commonwealth. And I do not want somebody being naturalized and taking a fake oath, which that is not uncommon in the sense of, well, we won't go there, but it is not impossible for somebody to swear falsely. They do. And say they will pledge allegiance to our flag and of the United States of America, but they really have allegiance to, say, let's see, the Taliban, Saudi Arabia. Let's go to that case that you put that amicus brief in for, because I thought it was so relevant. Tell the story. Is it Hamzi or Hamdi or?
Yasser Isam Hamdi. He was captured. He was captured on the battlefields of Afghanistan after 9/11. Transferred to Guantanamo Bay as an enemy combatant. And then the officials down there realized that he'd been born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, while his dad was working in Louisiana on an oil rig off the coast of Louisiana. And so they started treating him as a citizen. Ed Meese, former Attorney General of the United States under Ronald Reagan, and I filed a brief and saying, he's not a citizen. His parents were temporary visitors here on a temporary work visa. And it's time we get this notion of citizenship correct. Now, the Supreme Court, neither side was arguing that, so the Supreme Court didn't take it up. But Justice Scalia doesn't call him a citizen in his dissenting opinion. He calls him a presumed citizen, which, if you're born on the U.S. soil, we can presume you're going to be a citizen until we prove otherwise. But proving otherwise demonstrates that your parents owed allegiance to another country, and through them, you did as well when you were born. Look, it becomes crystal clear if you put it in the context of war. And there's a reason why under our naturalization laws, the oath you take is not just allegiance to the United States, but you have to renounce all allegiance to any other power. That's part of the oath. And there's under that, you no longer have an allegiance to the government of Ireland or Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan or whatever country you've left. When you become a naturalized citizen, you renounce that allegiance. Now, we end up with some weird things because some countries continue to play that old feudal card. Then you can't renounce your allegiance to us. We're going to continue to act as if you're our citizen. And our State Department, unfortunately, for diplomatic reasons, sometimes I wink the notion that, well, maybe they still are dual citizens. But it's a contradiction in terms. You owe ultimate allegiance to two different people. That just doesn't work.
That's impossible.
And it becomes very clear that it doesn't work when you go to war. If you're a dual citizen, let's say Canada and the United States go to war, and you're a dual U.S. Canadian citizen. Well, if you take up arms, join the American Army, and you're fighting Canada, you're committing treason against Canada because you owe them allegiance, and vice versa. In other words, you're in big trouble no matter what happens there. There's a reason why our naturalization laws require you to renounce the prior allegiance, because you can only have one ultimate allegiance like that.
It's sort of like saying, like you could have two wives and both of them would be your number one wife. It's just the wives are going to know that's really not true. I think that this
ask any wife of a sultan. They got a pecking order. They know exactly what it is, right?
Exactly, and there's a lot of arguing going on. This Hamdi case. I think I really believe that sometimes you have to take examples in your mind, create an intellectual picture in your mind, and essentially walk it through until, like an extreme case, take it to the outer boundaries. I call it sort of like maximalizing the argument and say, this is where it could go. And I really get tired of people just saying, oh, but no one would ever take a false oath of allegiance. No one would ever have their children, come here to have children or go on welfare for the money. I mean, it's all these things that we're supposed to believe that are clearly untrue. And to me, when I think of terrorism, which, yes, there was terrorism in the form of the Barbary pirates back at, Thomas Tom's day, Thomas Jefferson's day, and we dispatched that, I think, pretty
By the way,
well.
without a declaration of war from Congress, by the way, this becomes clear in the latest brouhaha over Gaza or over the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah.
The president or over the deportation of the terrorist thugs in the TRA group that Boasberg is blocking. The president has authority to repel attacks against the United States. He doesn't have to wait for a declaration of war from Congress to do it. He's the commander in chief, and his obligation is to take care that the law is faithfully executed. And that goes back, like I said, it goes back to Jefferson. Jefferson's attacks against the Barbary pirates didn't have a declaration of war from Congress because they were attacking us. There was already a state of war, and he was merely responding to.
Oh, yeah, because once somebody drops a bomb on your ship or shoots a missile at it or whatever, or a gun in your face, you're at war. That is a declaration of war, that violence. That's very interesting. I love that whole conversation about the Barbary Coast and all that. But back in Thomas Jefferson's day, you couldn't get on a plane, fly 3 hours, and be here. You couldn't come up through the Mexican border as a special alien or other than a Mexican, or come through Canada really easily. Today, you can be a terrorist and be around the world within a couple of days, and do your stuff. It's too convenient. It is too easy. And when you think about this Hamdi and the fact that we had to, I can't remember what the disposition of the case was, but what we had was a Taliban terrorist from Saudi Arabia, which had, 18 or so of the 19 terrorists on 9/11, who had never lived in this land other than a couple of years when he was a little one. And then he went back home with the Saudi Arabian parents to be a Saudi Arabian all his life until he became a Taliban terrorist, I suppose. And then suddenly, when he's in Gitmo, he's suddenly, oh, you're an American citizen.
And it's absurd, isn't it?
It
is.
is.
I think President Trump, the American people have got a lot of common sense about these things. Russians landing in Miami to have birth tourism, during the Cold War when they're our biggest enemy, or now China in Los Angeles. Paying $50,000 or $100,000 to stay at a luxury hotel for a couple of months and then have a baby, go back to China. And that person's raised under the Chinese Communist government and is an American citizen who can come here whenever they want and infiltrate our country. This is absurd. And the president's executive order tapped in to the common sense of the American people that know how absurd it is. And that, those are people that came here legally, although that's always a question because one of the things you're asked, are you pregnant when you're getting on a flight to come to the United States, to avoid this question? And then you're falsely saying no, then that means you committed a fraud in order to get here. But even if you didn't, you're here legally, people understand how this is crazy. And the notion that you don't even have to go through the legal process to get here, but you come here illegally to create citizens without the consent of the American people.
It's devious, it's dishonest, it's scheming. It is, it's what it does is it literally rewards scheming, lying, manipulative behavior for self, for the benefit of oneself or even their country at our expense. They're cheating, and we are rewarding that. And I don't, you know what? If I could X-ray, see into everybody's heart and mind, I would say, you can come in, you can't, you can come in. Because I'd say, you really have sincerity, right? You really want freedom. You want to build. You don't want to come here and create violence and theft and bring down this country. And you want to do good. You're sincere. You guys don't. You do. But we don't have that, do we? But one thing we do know is this. When somebody traipses across the border illegally, we know that they just committed a crime. We know that. Even if they're not hardened criminals. And also, when somebody gets on a plane from Saudi Arabia, who's a multimillionaire and stays at a 4-star, 5-star hotel and gives birth and goes home, they're fundamentally dishonest and manipulating our system, and not for our good, only for their own selfish purposes. So just from a moral standpoint, I don't want them and their values to be part of America. We have that right. We just can't really do it normally, but we can exclude those who try to manipulate the system. I think that fundamentally sovereignty is such an element, a basic element to this, a foundational element, because what Congress has plenary power in laws of citizenship and naturalization. And what we're saying is, in the 7 billion people that are outside of our borders right now and citizens, that Congress doesn't have plenary power, that the person in Bangladesh, Russia, UK, China, they do, because they can wake up, look at their spouse, say, you know what? I just found out I'm pregnant. Let's go make an American citizen. And we are choosing, we're in Beijing, and we literally just chose that we are going to give birth to an American citizen. And the people and the Congress and the president and our great-great-grandchildren have and the law has nothing to say about it.
No, it's all based on a misconception of the meaning of the 14th Amendment. But look, there's something else that President Trump did with his executive order, and he's directed the law enforcement agencies of the country to start looking at the money that we've been giving out through USAID and otherwise to these NGOs to facilitate this illegal immigration. Now, that's a federal crime as well. And I think one of the reasons the attacks on Elon Musk and Doge have become so violent and over the top is what he's exposing is a massive conspiracy to violate the laws of this country with our own tax dollars. And they're fighting like the Dickens not to have all that corruption see the light of day. But there are a lot of people that have been doing this for years that have been committing federal felonies. And I suspect before Kat Patel and Sam Bondi are done there, we're going to see a lot of these people in prison.
Are there enough attorneys in this country to prosecute everybody who broke the law in the last administration?
Well, probably not. But I always appreciate the efficacy of the IRS strategy. They can't prosecute all the tax dodgers, so they make a couple of high-profile criminal prosecutions right leading up to tax day, and it gets everybody else to voluntarily comply. You look at what President Trump's administration has already done with our rank and file border patrol agents and immigration service. Some very high-profile raids on illegal immigrants, and a lot of people are self-deporting now.
I know. I think that's wonderful. It is. It's so much better. Do you think what case is going to bring this birthright citizenship before the court? Are you worried at all? Because sometimes I see these things with Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, and I'm worried that these vitally important cases that are going to come up before we may lose, and then we may lose it all because everything's on the line.
Well, so two things. One, there is a case right now already at the Supreme Court. The Department of Justice is challenging the nationwide injunction aspects of the birthright citizenship cases. I filed an amicus brief with a number of other attorneys, just filed today, urging the court to take up the case and address the merits because it's pure issues of law. I don't know whether the Supreme Court's going to be persuaded by my historical analysis. I think they should be. But if they're not, I think what we'll find, it won't be the end of the matter. This issue now has so captured the attention of the American people that if the Supreme Court does not rule properly on what the actual meaning of the 14th Amendment is, then I think that will trigger a very quick and broad-based constitutional amendment effort. And I think there's enough states to actually get to 3/4
Have you done the
threshold.
math?
Yeah.
You have.
And you look at this. I think we win a constitutional amendment. Which, if the Supreme Court makes a constitutional interpretation that's flawed, it takes a constitutional amendment to fix it, or a subsequent court to reverse itself. So, we have the 13th and the 14th Amendment in response to a very bad Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case.
So we just do the same thing. But you think we have the numbers. The liberals, of course, the leftists, Democrats, whatever, they always, I just saw some headline, I didn't even read it, but, actually, I do have some of the language here. It's ridiculous. They're saying it requires a constitutional amendment for President Trump to, this executive order cannot be enforced. It requires a constitutional amendment, which I thought was absolutely absurd. They deliberately left the reader ignorant of all the context and the law, the legal, history.
I will say this though. Look, if the 14th Amendment actually did codify birthright citizenship, anybody born on the U.S. soil, except children of diplomats, are citizens. If that's what it said, and the subject of the jurisdiction clause wasn't there, then the president couldn't alter that as the Constitution. The issue here is, does the Constitution actually say that? And my view and your view is that it doesn't, and President Trump's view is that it doesn't. And therefore, we're gonna clarify this misunderstanding by actually faithfully interpreting the Constitution. They ignore the key question: is, does the Constitution actually provide for birthright citizenship? And if you answer that, well, no, it doesn't, then of course the president can enforce the law as it was intended, rather than as it's been distorted.
Well, the use of the term birthright, I've heard citizenship and is it constitutional? I've read some who have framed it that, yes, there is such a thing as birthright citizenship, because when somebody, like when I was born in the United States and I was subject to the jurisdiction thereof and in the state in which I resided, or whatever that is. So yeah, I got birthright citizenship. And then somebody else will say, well, no, it's not birthright citizenship. It's really just addressing an historic wrong with the Dred Scott case, slavery before that. And it's like a clean sweep, making it very, like you just were arguing. So in your way of speaking, is there such a thing as birthright citizenship? It's just being improperly defined? Or is there no such thing as birthright citizenship in the Constitution?
No, I mean, there is. Anybody born here and subject to the complete jurisdiction through their parent owing allegiance are citizens at birth. That's the definition of birthright citizenship. It's also the definition of natural-born citizen, the requirement to become president of the United States. If you've got to be a citizen from birth, not subsequently naturalized. Because even as you pointed out with your Irish heritage, if you're subsequently naturalized, you still have a deep feeling of regard for your former nation, and that divided, even if not technically a divided allegiance, certainly an emotional divided allegiance, is something the founders didn't want our president to have. So we've got a natural-born requirement, natural-born citizen for president of the United States. But if you're a citizen from birth, rather than a citizen subsequently naturalized, we call that birthright citizenship. If you're entitled to be treated as a citizen at the time of your birth because of the status of your parents. So, by the way, we used to ask on the passport form where you have to prove a citizenship, we used to ask not only what state you were born in, but what was the status of your parents when you were born? We asked that all the way up until 1967, and then all of a sudden
why did we turn that over? Because the new immigration law that went through, that was passed.
Here's my speculation: new immigration law went through in 1965, added some requirements, and that kicked it over to more than one page. And so some bureaucrat was told, figure out how to get this back down to one page. And he said, well, why are we asking about the parents? Let's get rid of that question. I have no idea what that, but given what I know of the bureaucracy, that just makes a whole lot of sense.
Oh, that is so. Well, my mother, like I said, she's 89. She comes up in practically every discussion I ever have. Yes, she is really a real person. And she says, Elizabeth, when I grew up, and people immigrated, they were they had to be sponsored by a church or a family, and they would take financial responsibility. And I don't know how that actually worked out for those but they could not become wards of the state or dependent upon some kind of a welfare type program. And so there was actually sort of like when the idea of having a jury of your peers, you would be in a community and people would know you, and these are your peers that are judging you. Having people, because there's that human connection and knowing people, having sponsorship, which by the way would not allow for mass immigration. That would destroy that.
Those laws are still on the books, and the sponsors are legally obligated if the person that they sponsored becomes a ward of the state and goes on public benefit. We just haven't enforced those laws.
We just stopped enforcing the law.
Yeah.
But when your church says, I want to help somebody at Yazidi or a Christian in Nigeria, or whatever, because they're killing everybody there, all the Christians, we want to sponsor 3 Christians or a Christian family from Nigeria. When they come over, there's a connection, and they're there helping them along the way. This birthright citizenship, we're literally saying, come in, drop a baby
with
that day.
No connections.
No love.
Build your own, replicate your old community here as if you're no part of the American body politic, and then alter the fundamental nature of our country. And by the way, one other aspect of this, and then I've got to run. We're kind of out of time here. One other aspect of this, in 1820, if you came over from Europe across the Atlantic, you didn't make, if you were Ben Franklin, you made that trip a lot because he was a diplomat, but you didn't make that trip more than once in your life. The very act of coming here, when transportation made it very difficult, was an indication that you were taking up a permanent residence here. And if we allowed you to come here with that understanding, there was that mutual consent, even though it wasn't explicit. That's no longer true. As you pointed out, people can come here, fly in a few hours and be here and have a child and then go home and never have any connection with the United States at all. It's an insane policy. We would never adopt it purposely if we were given a chance to vote on it. And yet this misinterpretation that has crept into our understanding over the last half century, altering a meaning that had been fairly fixed for the first century after the 14th Amendment was passed. It's utterly destroyed, and without our consent, without our approval, without even us having a say about it.
I know you have to go, but I still have at least 1 minute with you, so I'm joking. I'm going to take that. A regular American who's not going to read 25 pages on papers on it and all that, even when you try to find this out, it's not there. How did we flip from what we understood it to be in 1866, 68 at all? And there were things like the slaughterhouse case and whatever, these different cases. And then suddenly there's Wong, but nobody understood it, as far as I understand, to be overturning and no one understood it. And it wasn't enacted upon, where people literally came in, had babies left, or those children became citizens for some time. Have you ever found out what case or what attorneys general or what border patrol agency, who changed this understanding?
No official pronouncement, no official case. There's a footnote in dicta in a Supreme Court case called Filer versus Doe in the 1980s that just assumes that this understanding was correct, but it doesn't really address it. It's about the late 1960s where people start acting as if Wong Kim Ark settled the question the other direction. And most scholars, until Trump comes on the scene, agreed that Wong Kim Ark didn't settle the question for temporary visitors and for illegal immigrants. But politically now they are realigning with the politics of their preferred political party to say otherwise. And so you've got a lot of dishonesty going on in the scholarship over the last 30, 40 years, but really heightened over the last decade. I mean, I was debating this with scholars who on the other side of my understanding of the 14th Amendment, but they all agreed that Wong Kim Ark didn't settle the question until about the last decade, and they're all running the other direction now.
What happened in the last decade that made that change?
Yeah.
The last question I'm going to ask you is this: when I read popular, CNN or Newsweek or any of that garbage, I will, no offense to Josh Hammer, what I will see is they say this long settled, they will have to overturn a constitutional amendment. They will have, it is a long settled, agreed doctrine, birthright citizenship, yada, yada, yada.